Hello and welcome to another episode of PodcastDX, the show that brings you interviews with people just like you, whose lives were forever changed by a medical diagnosis. I'm Lita.
I'm Ron.
And I'm Jean Marie.
Collectively, we're the hosts of PodcastDX. On today's show, we're speaking with Faith Louise Cooper. Faith Louise is a certified holistic nutritionist and is joining us today to talk about juvenile rheumatoid arthritis and Ehlers Danlos Syndrome.
Hi, Faith
Hi,
Louise.
good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi. Faith Louise, what are juvenile rheumatoid arthritis and hypermobile Ehlers Danlos Syndrome for our listeners that haven't heard of these terms before?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised about the JRA. Juvenile rheumatoid arthritis is an older term. It's actually been changed to juvenile idiopathic arthritis as we have learned more about arthritis. But when I was diagnosed, it was JRA.
Okay.
It is an autoimmune and anti-inflammatory disease, which basically means that the body fights its own body and
It's kind of like a fight within yourself, right?
Yeah. So your immune system thinks your own body is a foreign invader and
Gotcha.
fights it. So
That's not good. And there are several types of JIA, right?
yeah. So juvenile arthritis is one of the subtypes under juvenile arthritis, and there are 6 types of juvenile arthritis.
Okay.
Of the juvenile idiopathic arthritis.
Okay.
And
And go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just want to say, you asked about the Ehlers Danlos Syndrome.
Yes.
It is a genetic condition that affects the performance of your collagen. So you basically have faulty collagen, which is a lot of what keeps your joints and all your systems in place in your body. And the hypermobility portion is one of 13 types of Ehlers Danlos syndrome.
Thank you.
Oh, wow.
Thank you very much.
Faith Louise, what symptoms first led you to seek out medical care? And also, how long did it take you to get a diagnosis?
So some of the first symptoms I had was stiffness and pain in the morning. I didn't necessarily say anything, but because who gets hurt or in the middle of the night? That just, and I think some of it is I have another sister who was dealing with had cancer before I did. So there's kind of like don't want to say anything and wave the boat. But eventually was playing with my neighbors and tripped, and that kind of blew everything it really went into full blown. And then I went to my own pediatric doctor, and when I was 12, and they said, this is not a sprain, it's not a break, and sent me to a rheumatologist. I'm fortunate that there is a pediatric rheumatologist because I was in Michigan at the time. And I was fortunate there was one. I had a 3.5-hour drive. There's only one pediatric rheumatologist for every 700 children that have juvenile arthritis.
Wow.
Some have to go out of the state. There's only 2 in the state of Michigan, and they're both on the east coast.
Wow. That's rough.
Yeah. So if any doctors out there that are looking for a specialty.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
There actually is grants and that for those who are going into if you want to go into a specialty for pediatric rheumatology.
Well, that's
okay.
good to know.
Yeah.
Medical students that are listening,
Yes.
there you go. Help pay for that education. And with the symptoms that you had, was the doctor able to make a diagnosis, or did you have to have genetic testing or other type of testing to determine if the symptoms and find a definitive diagnosis?
So for the rheumatoid arthritis, they did some blood work. I had the positive ANA. So they were able to do a definitive diagnosis. we hadn't, the EDS actually took longer to diagnose.
Okay.
Probably had symptoms as early as elementary school. And it wasn't until 2015, and then even in middle school, like rolling my ankle, very common. Started having issues. A lot of it dealt with numbness in my hands. It took several years, 2 EMGs.
We hate those.
They lost the first one, never got to my doctor, but it was good that I went to the second one because they were the ones that really sat and listened to the questions and said, sounds like it's autoimmune, go to rheumatology. And seeing that I was overly flexible and did a huge questionnaire. There's a brain scale that is used. And actually, so that was in 2017, Ashley was diagnosed with Hypermobility Syndrome, not EDS.
Okay.
2017, the criteria changed and they said the one thing I was missing was family history.
Oh, okay.
Later, my sister was diagnosed with the Ehlers Danlos Syndrome, hypermobility. So I had moved several times then I moved to Texas, had a new rheumatologist because you moved new place, we did a second evaluation. My brain scale went from a 4 to like a 7. And with that, it was like, I probably have it. We did not do genetic testing because hypermobility is the one type that there is not a genetic marker. And the fact that that's what my sister had, it didn't seem that worthwhile. She went through the genetic testing. I did not.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, Faith Louise, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions about juvenile idiopathic arthritis and also about the hypermobility?
The most misconception of the arthritis is an aging disease and only old people get it. So when you dealing with, this is probably for both, you're having pain like in your back or, issues typing or walking. Oh, only old people. Like you're too young to deal with it. I've got a group of books on arthritis and I was told you're too young to be interested in this topic. So it's an age misconception. You can actually get it as early as infancy.
Wow.
Arthritis. There is definitely for genetic conditions that it is. I think also with the Ehlers Danlos, people think that being flexible is a benefit, but not realizing that all the other issues and pain that goes along with it, plus the fact that we have collagen in way more than just our muscular skeletal. It's actually also in your cardiovascular. You end up with dysautonomia. It's your skin looking younger than normal. So there's a lot of different things that it's a lot more than just flexible joints.
Right.
Yeah, even healing is kind of a pain when you have Ehlers Danlos, which is unfortunate. Faith Louise, how common is JIA and Ehlers Danlos and hypermobility, that version of it?
JRA, sorry, I'm still used to it because that's what I was.
That's fine.
We understand.
Juvenile arthritis, the umbrella is one. There are 300,000 children currently in the United States that have it. So it's actually more common than juvenile diabetes and MS.
Wow.
Ehlers Danlos syndrome is considered a rare disease. In fact, we are considered zebras. That's our logo.
Huh.
Everybody needs a good one.
Yeah. And because doctors don't automatically,
and some types are more rare than others. The hypermobility is the most common.
Okay. Faith Louise, before you were diagnosed, had you heard about juvenile arthritis or Ehlers Danlos in the past? Have you heard of those terms used? Any family, friends, or anybody else that had it possibly that you kind of already knew what to expect?
Juvenile arthritis, I haven't heard, and I still don't know anyone personally. Fortunately, now we have Facebook to connect, but until we didn't have Facebook and those connections when I was a teenager going. So I did not know anyone with it. I still don't personally know anyone with it. Ehlers Danlos Syndrome, I had heard about it with the Hypermobility Syndrome. When I heard about it at that point, I didn't know anyone. My sister was diagnosed between that hypermobility syndrome and my Ehlers Danlos syndrome, part of the reason. So I do know someone personally with that, and I know someone else with just the hypermobility syndrome. So that it seems to be the more rare one. I know more people that have it.
Okay. Thank you.
And Faith Louise, how have you and your healthcare team or healthcare providers chosen to treat these conditions?
So with the juvenile arthritis, when I had it, the only treatment, because there wasn't much known about arthritis, was the NSAIDs, non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs.
Oh, wow.
So that was the only treatment. Fortunately for those diagnosed now, there is a lot more options.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how we treated it. It's all about managing the symptoms. We're not actually in either one going towards attacking the true root cause. I do take some medication now to deal with the vibrating at night so I can sleep, and pain in the morning. Iron supplements because I have low iron. It's a lot more. PT's the most helpful and beneficial that I have found with it, and I do look at things like heat and some alternatives just in myself and learning my own body and what helps me.
Okay. So you do use heat. Some people use ice. Some people use heat. Some people use massage or acupuncture. Have you considered any of those?
I usually most of the time use ice because of inflammation. You want to reduce it with ice. With the arthritis, I used heat because you want to keep circulation going. Heat's more for cramps. I have thought about massage therapy. The biggest thing is finding somebody who's familiar enough with Ehlers Danlos syndrome because our skeletal system is so different. I did have a PT that I think did some of that when I was in California and Texas. So I've looked into it more. Alternative is looking at nutrition and herbs and what tends to be those preventative of anti-inflammatory and things that will naturally help reduce pain.
Sure.
Right, because you're a nutritionist now, right?
Yes. And that's part of wanting to, I want to have all the tools in my toolbox to things, and I want others to have it as well. I want them to be equipped, educated, and empowered to live enriching lives, and so they can be in control, not their disease diagnosis label that they have.
Right. Are there certain foods that are better to eat if you have Ehlers Danlos? So
Ehlers Danlos syndrome, it depends on some. I do not have gastroparesis, but a lot have gastroparesis, so some of them will end up actually on feeding tubes, so there'll be nutrition. But there are, because with pain management, we end up with inflammation not in the joints but in general. So things like pineapple on an empty stomach, tart cherry juice, ginger's good with inflammation. Ginger's also good on the stomach, which we have issues with. So ginger, turmeric, those are some of the great. It's good to avoid your animal proteins, meats, because they are higher in inflammatories. Eggs are not good because we are more likely to have UTIs, and there are things in eggs that aggravate UTIs.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, right. Well, Faith Louise, what are some of the less obvious parts of your life that are affected by the JIA and the Hypermobility Ehlers Danlos Syndrome?
One of the things, I think it's been a journey of changes. You feel very isolated. As we discussed, I don't really know anyone with JRA. So being a teenager going through puberty and not knowing things, and you don't want to say anything because of the stigmas around it being, only an adult thing that only old people get. You don't want to be treated as inferior or different. So it's very much of an isolating thing.
Mm-hmm.
I have learned, and it's actually, in the long run on the journey, I've learned to actually enjoy things more, because I used to not be able to even stand for 15 minutes, and I was able to get into running and triathlon. I found them better because the swimming and the biking are less hard because there's not the impact. And I actually swam was the only thing that relieved pain when I was on. So I would never have been on the high school swim team if I hadn't had it. And so having that joy on doing things that I couldn't do before, and I've now learned how to do, and discovering the strength in doing so as well, and that I am very strong, perseverance, and just being able to face challenges and keep going through it. I think those are things that having a chronic condition have taught me in the long run, and that what I can do physically doesn't define who I am. I can't run right now, but that doesn't mean that I'm not an athlete, because there's other aspects that I've learned.
It sounds like those are really good lessons to have learned.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Faith Louise, do you have any advice to somebody who was recently diagnosed with JIA or Ehlers Danlos? And what's the best advice that you personally have heard in the past?
Probably one of the best advice is to listen to your body and know your body. And on good days, don't over push yourself. I always say I've heard to increase your activity by 1%, so you don't feel it the next day.
Mm-hmm.
But my advice is to surround people who see value in you, and see that you have great value and contribution to the world, even with having the chronic condition, that they can see past that and see who you are.
Good
have
advice.
That.
I guess I skipped a line here. I'm sorry. Have you gotten any support during your healthcare journey from your friends or family?
And it sounds like your family had a lot on its plate.
Yeah, I think there is support. There's been a back and forth. Probably my sister's been my biggest support. When I was a teenager, wasn't quite, because things were so different. But now that she has several chronic conditions, but I mean, they were the ones that traveled with me to willing to drive 3.5 hours to go to a doctor's appointment, and make sure I was involved with the quiz team, and the coach really make sure, like, if there was only like a couple beds, I ended up with the bed, which is an awkward thing, but when you need those accommodations, but you don't want to stand out. But there is just the support. Very few, very close friends. I probably haven't been vocal about my conditions until within the last 2 years.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Faith Louise, do you have any additional tips or any advice for someone living with a chronic disease or illness? What do you suggest?
I suggest the biggest thing, you need to have a support system around you to help you in those challenging days, but to celebrate you with you in when you have those victories. And like I said, you need to listen to your body. Only you know what works. Everybody's chronic condition, everyone that has JRA or especially EDS is very different, and because it's not just your genes, even though it's genetic, it's also your environment. To just listen to your body and be your advocate, especially if you're still on that diagnosis journey. You need to make sure especially with EDS, you get bounced around because we're not in one, like we don't fit in any of the categories. We're not here or there because it affects so much. To just continue, be okay firing a doctor and finding another one. I've fired two doctors in my time in Texas, and that was only a year.
Wow.
Well, no, that's definitely some good advice. And like you said, be your own advocate and your own body and all of that. We do appreciate you coming on our show and sharing your story with us. How can our listeners learn more about you personally and also about JIA and the Hypermobility Ehlers Danlos?
I'll tell you, when I looked at facts about how common it is, I looked at the Arthritis Foundation and the Ehlers Danlos Syndrome. You can reach out to me personally on Facebook. I'm on as Faith Louise Cooper. I'm on Instagram as Speaking of Try, and LinkedIn, Faith Louise Cooper. And I have a link if you would like to set up some time to talk to me personally.
Please.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Free time to be able to ask any questions you have and about the condition.
Great. Super.
Yeah, we definitely appreciate that.
Yes.
Yeah, and then we'll list those on your page on our website as well.
Right.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Faith Louise, for joining us today. If our listeners have any questions or comments related to today's show, they can contact us at PodcastDX@yahoo.com, on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, or Instagram.
And if you have a moment to spare, please give us a review wherever you get your podcast. As always, please keep in mind that this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or treatment and before undertaking a new healthcare regime. And never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you've heard on this podcast.
Till next week.